This is the part of the video, and yes, I recognize that this is the beginning of the video, that I wish past me decided on something different to slot in between the darkness and Danganronpa. He thought it was a good idea, but sadly he'd be proven wrong in the matter of 4 hours, 35 minutes, and 7 seconds. Let's talk about Wario World. I knew going into Wario World that the game wasn't great, but wasn't liquid garbage. While I won't say it is the worst thing I've experienced, as the worst game I've played will still be Devil May Cry 2, and the worst movie experience I've ever had was Batman v Superman, Wario World is pretty bad. I do remember playing the game as a kid and someone enjoying it, but I chalk that up to being so little that I couldn't notice how poor it was. The one good thing I can say is that I'm demonstrating the point of this series. While the exact date that development started for the game is unknown, I'm going to presume 2001 was when work first started on the game. While Nintendo, particularly their Research and Development No. 1 department, was working on the game, as this is a Nintendo-developed game, their co-developer was not announced until April of 2003. The co-developer was Treasure, who had a working agreement with Nintendo due to their previous collaboration on the game Sin and Punishment.
Get bonus!
While Sin and Punishment was never released in America, except for its virtual console release in 2007 on the Wii, it was widely imported and dubbed one of the best Nintendo 64 games ever.
I want to start things off by saying that Sin and Punishment is without a doubt the biggest travesty on the N64. Not because it's a bad game, but because I find it absolutely shocking that this was never released worldwide.
However, the development for Sin could best be described as arduous, as Nintendo director Hitoshi Yamagami had many problems with Treasure. Such problems included Treasure not reaching deadlines and outright deflecting requests from Nintendo. The development period for Sin was also much longer than any other game on the Nintendo 64, as it started development in 1997 and was released in 2000, near the end of the Nintendo 64's lifetime. However, in an interview Satoru Iwata had with Masato Magawa, the president of Treasure, Iwata notes that despite Treasure having a small team, they accomplished a lot for Sin and Punishment. Magawa would also go on to state that with a smaller team, there are less conflicting issues that would plague a larger team, and that Treasure was able to make the game they wanted to make. That's why I figure that Wario World started development in 2001, as an E3 demo was released in 2002, and Treasure just released Ikaruga for the arcades. The 2002 demo showcased Horror Manor, Pecan Sands, and a boss, Clownaround. A thing to note about this demo was the camera and how it focused entirely on Wario. Nintendo wanted to make sure that the camera wasn't an issue, as seen through the level design in the demo. The 2003 demo added more items for players to collect, adding some depth to the gameplay. Originally, Wario World was supposed to release on November 11, 2002 in North America, but the date was pushed back to May 26, 2003, and then June 23, 2003, which was its release date in North America. Japan surprisingly got the game in 2004, a role reversal for most Eastern developed games. The version of the game I played was the North American release via emulation. To say this game has a story is pretty laughable, but the story opens up with a title crawl detailing the Black Jewel. It feeds on the wishes of the selfish and wicked and in return releases monsters. It potentially could have overrun the world with evil spirits, but the Spritelings decided that was weak and sealed the jewel away in their temple. All was good until people forgot what happened in the past, and Wario, the greedy, self-serving person that he is, stole the jewel from the ruins of the temple. The jewel, having been basically connected to an Energizer battery, decides to transform all of Wario's treasure into monsters. It is up to Wario now to venture across 4 different lands, reacquire his treasure, and save all the Spritelings, as only they can restore Wario's castle to its former glory. I don't know what I can say here besides that the story is serviceable. For this type of game, I don't expect a grand overarching story. The jewel is evil and transformed all of Wario's stuff. Get it back and pile drive anything to do so. The Spritelings are just there so Wario can get his castle back, and as MacGuffins they are not interesting, but again, this is a platformer, so I don't expect the things I'm collecting to be all that engaging. I think that the story mostly relies on the worlds that Wario travels through, which are varied and fascinating. It feels like Wario is going on this grand adventure to get his treasure back from an evil jewel, which is the best thing I can can say about the story. One thing to note before I move on to presentation is that I'm not going to put story under the bad section, as I don't fault the game for having an overall average story. Wario World does keep something in common with the other Wario games. It has some really strange designs. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, however. I think out of all the mainline Nintendo games, I think Wario is one of the few games that is allowed to have experimental designs. Sure, you have the lush and colorful worlds that are modeled and textured pretty well, but in come some of the enemies and bosses, setting apart this game from the rest of Nintendo's lineup at the time. From googly-looking pterodactyls to creepy dolls inspired by The Exorcist, Wario World doesn't pull any punches with its designs. I think the only overall weak one is the black jewel, and that's only because it is just a jewel with an eye and tentacles. Yes, most enemies are palette swapped, but they at least fit in with the theme of the level, and the unique enemies that do exist are the standouts. Going away from the strange designs, I think Wario is modeled and animated pretty well, like they took him from one of the 2D games and put him in 3D. This version of Wario is still not a patch on Wario Land 4 Wario or Wario Land Shake It Wario, but that is because both 4 and Shake It are beautifully animated 2D games. The music is another good point in the presentation, with a huge focus on horns and drums. However, there are some trademark Wario stank tracks, like the pause theme. It is hard to describe what the actual genre of music these tracks belong to, but they fit in the game perfectly. Charles Martinet is the only major voice actor in the game, and much like when he voices Luigi, he is given much more range when playing Wario compared to Mario. He gives some girthy line reads that help portray Wario as a powerhouse. The sound effects are a bit generic, but the game has a good usage of audio callouts, as it's extremely easy to tell when a spriteling is in an area or that a treasure chest is nearby. The only bad thing I can say about the presentation is that the puzzle rooms are pretty bare bones when it comes to their design, and I don't like the UI elements as they are pretty generic. Wario World is a 3D platform brawler with a focus on puzzle solving and collecting items. Wario, while not as gifted as Mario or Luigi in the jumping department, can still perform a short hop by pressing the jump button. Wario also controls a bit slippery, and while it's not as bad as, say, Luigi, tight platforming can give Wario an issue, as well as smaller platforms and tilted platforms. Remember playing Super Mario Sunshine and sliding off platforms? It's like that, only that the technology hasn't been perfected in between that game and the release of this one. Where Wario is gifted is in the fighting department. Wario can perform a 3-hit combo that generally knocks down standard mooks. Wario also has access to a ground pound for hitting enemies and switches, a shoulder tackle that gives him a bit of speed and repeatedly hits his enemies, a suction move that collects coins and garlic, and a dash jump. The dash jump is not only a way to get more distance when making a jump, it also counts as an attack. However, most enemies don't take damage when hit with any of Wario's moves. They instead get dizzy. This allows Wario to pick up his enemies and do attacks that actually damage his enemies. Those attacks being the throw, the spinning pile driver, and the giant swing. The throw, which is the simplest of all the damaging attacks, just requires the player to press and hold the attack button while holding an enemy to charge up the throw, then let go of the button to throw the enemy. The throw is the most interesting of Wario's damaging attacks, as not only can the enemy take damage by being thrown, if they happen to fall into a pit after taking damage from the throw, they will take more damage. The spinning pile driver uses the same motion that the ground pound uses, and some enemies, when the pile driver is used on them, shoot out an object that hits high above Wario. The giant swing just requires Wario to pick up an enemy and rotate the control stick, and is the most useful for crowd control. Take note that the control stick doesn't have to be rotating for the entire duration of the spin, as once Wario picks up speed, he will automatically spin, allowing the player to move freely. The giant spin, much like a pile driver, does have some utility outside of combat, as it allows Wario to open up spin gates. There are also objects that Wario can pick up freely to use as damaging attacks. The last thing to note about the controls is that the player can slightly shift the camera either left or right to see in those directions, but the camera is generally locked in place save the puzzle rooms, which I will get to. Basic mooks come in a few varieties, from small fry that go down with Wario's regular attacks, to middleweights that get dizzy when damaged enough, to big bastards that may block Wario's attacks, and finally flying nuisances that generally dodge most of Wario's damaging attacks. There are unique enemies in stages, like the scorpions that require Wario to knock them out of the sand to hurt them, and the icicles which create platforms when pile-drived, but most enemies are the basic 4. Each stage sees Wario head from the beginning of it to the end of it while trying to collect various items along the way. The two most important items for Wario to collect in a stage are the spritelings and the crystals. Spritelings are locked in cages and make a highly specific sound when Wario is nearby. Spritelings don't inherently do anything until the end of the game, where the amount of spritelings the player collected determines their ending, with all 40 spritelings gathered granting the best ending in the game. Most spritelings are in the main stage of a level, though some are inside puzzle rooms just like the crystals. The crystals are needed to finish a level, but each world only needs Wario to collect a specific amount of the crystals. Each level has 8 red crystals, but the most that is needed to finish a level is 6, and that is only in the final world. Crystals are always found in puzzle rooms. The puzzle rooms make up one half of the gameplay, as the other half is just running through the levels. Puzzle rooms always include a crystal, but might also include a spriteling or trophy piece. Each puzzle room is different and has either a platforming challenge for Wario to partake in or a simple logic puzzle. Puzzle rooms give the player full control of the camera, making the platforming challenges easier as the player can just take a bird's eye view to easily see how platforms are spaced. The platforming puzzle rooms are usually above bottomless pits that if Wario falls in, he has to restart the challenge. There's 2 platforming rooms that are different from the rest, as both use a hidden mechanic in the game. Wario keeps momentum when he moves, meaning if a platform is moving forward and Wario jumps, he'll move forward as he's carrying the momentum of the platform. The 2 rooms in question have Wario latch onto glue balls that hold Wario in place, and then thrust out fast. The player has to time the press of the jump button at the height of the thrust to maximize Wario's distance so he can clear the bottomless pit. Do take note that Wario can immediately stop in the air if the player uses the ground pound. Puzzle room doors come in 2 flavors, wood and steel. Wood doors just need Wario to ground pound them open, while steel doors need a pile driver. There is a bit of hitbox dissonance with the steel doors as Wario does slightly jump after a pile driver is finished, meaning if the pile driver is not positioned correctly, Wario won't fall through. The other collectibles found within a level are the aforementioned trophy pieces, treasure boxes, coins, and garlic. There are 8 trophy pieces within a level, and just like the spritelings, they make a unique sound cue that alerts the player towards their presence, and sometimes show up in puzzle rooms. When all 8 pieces are found, the trophy gets created outside of the World Select stage, and Wario earns half a heart. While the trophies aren't needed to get the good ending, having increased health makes some of the later stages a bit easier. The treasure boxes, which are connected to colored buttons in the level, unlock mini-games for WarioWare Mega Micro games, though a GBA link cable is needed to play them. Coins, which are dropped by enemies and bosses alike, allow Wario to buy garlic from the garlic vendor, as well as revive himself when he dies. In some levels, the game will throw an arena challenge at the player, where they have to kill as many enemies as possible in 60 seconds. The more waves cleared, the more coins the player will earn. Garlic, which can be found in levels and bought from the garlic vendor, gives Wario a full heart of health. Just like how some levels have arenas, some levels force Wario to fight a strange crystal monster that can only be dizzied by having its minions thrown into it. When the monster is alive, it locks Wario in a space with it, meaning the player has to kill the monster to move on. Each world has 3 levels, 2 basic stages, and a boss. Each stage ends with a boss, and almost every boss can only be damaged by the throw, swing, or pile driver. There are a few exceptions, like the Antlion and Red Brief J, and some bosses do have a gimmick, like Mean MC and Dual Dragon. When a world boss has been defeated, Wario earns a piece of the key to the giant chest and unlocks the next world. When all key pieces have been found, Wario can fight the Black Jewel. At the end of every level is the Bye Bye Balloon, which allows Wario to return back to the beginning of the stage in case the player has missed anything. The last thing to mention is when Wario falls into a bottomless pit in the main stages. He gets taken to the lair of the Unithorns, which will rob Wario of his coins. Falling into the water of the Unithorns lair will also drain Wario of coins. The player must find the correct box that holds the spring to escape the lair, as the other boxes contain bombs. The best part of Wario World is just how out there the game is. You have a money-grubbing plumber trying to restore his castle and his treasure because an evil sentient jewel decided that it wanted to take over the world and transform said plumber's treasure into monsters. Those monsters including a pig and a lizard in a Speedo, an evil clown, a possessed doll, and a pirate captain. Wario World keeps the tone of the older Wario games, which has always been weird, and brings it into 3D. The designs are so strange and bizarre that I can't help but like them. This even pertains to the music, which has standard arrangements, but has some downright offbeat tracks. Some of the puzzle rooms are pretty fun, especially the 2 momentum puzzles. The game doesn't tell the player that Wario carries momentum when he stands on a moving object. The player has to figure that out for themselves, that Wario can carry momentum to clear large gaps, and it leads to the 2 most creative puzzles in the game. Figuring out the momentum mechanic and stopping in midair is generally a neat idea, and I wish the game had more puzzles that used both mechanics. The novelty of Wario throwing his enemies is also enjoyable, but I think this is where most of the problems show up in Wario World. The biggest strike against Wario World is how tedious it is. Everything you do in the first level in the game is done for the entire game. Sure, there are level gimmicks like the mirror level, but level composition is practically the same throughout each world. It doesn't help that the main focus of the game is its combat, which is about as deep as The Last of Us. It is pretty novel to see Wario chuck enemies around like they mean nothing to him, but that is all the player can do to damage enemies. It is easier just to avoid enemies unless the game forces the player to fight them. It's not like fighting enemies is worthwhile either. Coins are only used to buy garlic or revive Wario, and the game is not all that difficult to begin with. Bosses are probably the lowlight of the entire game, which says a lot because Wario has always had entertaining bosses, particularly from 4 and Shake It. Boss attack patterns are too slow, making most fights boring or just time sinks, and don't require much of any effort to beat. The only hard bosses are the gimmicked ones, like Mean MC, but that's only because the gimmick can be annoying to aggravating. The worst of the worst is the jewel, as the player has to destroy 5 crystals holding spritlings just to be able to pick up the jewel and do a damaging attack. All the jewel does is shoot beams of fire to cut off Wario, which only do half a heart of damage, meaning there is no repercussion if the player just decides to eat damage to 3 spritlings. The big shame to this is that the Japanese version of the boss is more interactive, as it has a second phase with different attacks. Puzzle rooms are not immune to the tediousness either, as some rooms are long platforming sections that may have to be redone multiple times, just because Wario's fat ass can't help but slide off a platform. The worst of this is the rotating platform room, which gives me violent flashbacks to Sunshine and made me slam my desk after I failed it so many times. Some levels also have annoying collectible locations, like Shivering Mountains, where if the player missed the item the first time, they either have to exit the level and re-enter it, or use the buy balloon to go back to the beginning of the stage to attempt to grab the collectible again. You are not missing anything if you skip Wario World. Its main issue is that it's so painfully average and dull, something that Wario Land 4 and Shake It are not. The presentation is fantastic, but the selling point of the game is its gameplay, and Wario World's gameplay is not worth it. Still, if you want to give it a try, boot up Dolphin and give it a whirl.